When I speak of rarity, I do not speak of superiority, nor of virtue, nor of some flattering exception granted to a chosen few. I speak of psychic configuration, of an arrangement of forces within the soul that is uncommon, and therefore deeply uncomfortable both for the one who carries it and for the world that must encounter it. You may already feel a faint unease as you listen, because the psyche recognizes itself long before the intellect consents. If something in you tightens, if an old, nameless tension begins to stir, that is no accident. It is often the first sign that the unconscious is leaning forward, attentive, wary, prepared to be seen. There are individuals whose inner life does not move along the well-worn paths of collective adaptation. They do not simply absorb the values, attitudes, and rhythms of the surrounding world. Instead, they experience life as if from a slight distance, not because they wish to withdraw, but because their psyche is structured around a different center of gravity. Such a person is often misunderstood very early in life. As a child, they sense too much, ask questions that feel out of place, react with an intensity that seems disproportionate to the situation. Adults may call them difficult, dreamy, aloof, overly serious, or strangely mature. What is rarely recognized is that the psyche of such a child is already oriented inward, toward a dialogue with forces that most people never consciously meet. You see, the majority of human beings live primarily in the realm of the persona, that functional mask through which we adapt to society. This is not a moral failing, it is a necessity of civilization. Without the persona, there would be chaos, but in some individuals, the persona never fully becomes the dominant structure. It remains thin, permeable, almost translucent. Through it, contents from the unconscious seep easily into consciousness. Image, moods, intuitions, and symbolic impressions arise unbidden. The world is not experienced merely as a set of external facts, but as a living field of meaning. A gesture carries weight, a coincidence hums with significance, a dream lingers like a message that refuses to be ignored. Such people often suffer from a chronic sense of not belonging, even when they appear socially integrated. They may have friends, lovers, profession, even public success, and yet a quiet alienation persists beneath the surface. This alienation is not necessarily loneliness. It is something subtler and more unsettling. It is the feeling of being oriented toward a different horizon than the one everyone else seems to be facing. While others move toward outer validation, status, and shared ideals, this person is repeatedly drawn back into an inner conversation they did not choose and cannot silence. One of the most telling signs of this rare psychic structure is a peculiar relationship with solitude. Solitude is not merely preferred, it is required. Without periods of withdrawal, the psyche becomes overstimulated, fragmented, exhausted. And yet, solitude is not always peaceful. In fact, it is often during solitude that the most intense inner experiences arise. Images surface, old memories reconfigure themselves, emotions emerge without obvious cause. The person may feel haunted by their own inner world, as though the unconscious were insisting on being taken seriously. This is not pathology in itself, but it becomes dangerous when misunderstood or suppressed. Another sign, equally uncomfortable, is a heightened sensitivity to falseness. These individuals can tolerate suffering, ambiguity, and even conflict far better than they can tolerate lies, especially lies they are expected to live. They may endure difficult relationships, harsh environments, or long periods of uncertainty, but they wither in situations that require them to betray their inner truth. This makes conventional success difficult. They cannot simply play the game, even when they know the rules. Something in them resists, not out of rebellion, but out of psychic necessity. To live falsely feels to them like a slow suffocation. This sensitivity extends beyond morality into the realm of symbolism. They are acutely aware of the gap between words and intentions, between appearances and underlying motives. A polite smile may feel hostile, a compliment hollow, a ritual empty. Conversely, a simple gesture, a moment of silence, or an unexpected dream image may carry enormous weight. The psyche of such a person is tuned less to surface reality and more to what I have called the objective psyche, that deeper layer of the unconscious, which speaks in symbols rather than concepts. Often, these individuals experience powerful dreams from an early age, not the trivial dreams that evaporate upon waking, but dreams that feel autonomous, authoritative, and emotionally charged. A dream may recur for years, changing slightly, as if it were guiding an inner process independent of the ego's wishes. Such dreams are not to be dismissed as mere byproducts of daily life. They are communications from the unconscious, attempts to correct the one-sidedness of consciousness, to point toward a destiny that has not yet been consciously accepted. Here we must speak of destiny, though the word makes modern minds uneasy. By destiny, I do not mean a fixed sequence of events imposed from outside. I mean an inner necessity, a pattern of becoming that arises from the totality of the psyche. For the rare personality, this destiny often involves confrontation with the shadow at a depth and intensity that others never encounter. Their shadow is not merely a collection of socially unacceptable traits. It is rich, complex, and often terrifying. It may contain aggression, envy, and destructive impulses, but also immense creativity, insight, and vitality, because their consciousness is relatively open to the unconscious. These individuals cannot easily project their shadow onto others without feeling the falseness of the projection. They sense, often painfully, that what they despise or fear in others has a corresponding root within themselves. This produces a moral tension that is difficult to sustain. Many either collapse into self-condemnation or inflate into a false sense of superiority in an attempt to escape this tension. Neither solution works for long. The psyche demands integration, not denial. You may notice that such individuals often go through repeated cycles of inner death and rebirth. Periods of intense meaning are followed by phases of emptiness, disorientation, or despair. From the outside, this can look like instability. From the inside, it feels more like a series of initiations. Each collapse strips away an outdated identity, a role that once served but now constrains. Each rebirth brings a slightly deeper alignment with the self, that central archetype of wholeness which transcends the ego. It is crucial to understand that this process is not chosen. No one volunteers for it. In fact, many spend years trying to avoid it, numbing themselves through work, relationships, ideology, or distraction. But the unconscious is patient, it waits, and when avoidance becomes too costly, it intervenes, sometimes through illness, sometimes through loss, sometimes through a sudden and inexplicable collapse of meaning. What appears as misfortune from the outside is often, at a deeper level, a corrective movement of the psyche. Another uncomfortable sign of this rare personality is an ambivalent relationship with authority. These individuals are not necessarily rebellious, but they are instinctively skeptical of any authority that claims absolute validity. They may respect knowledge, experience, and wisdom, but they resist domination of thought. This is because their psyche is already governed by an inner authority, one that does not speak in rules but in symbols, emotions, and ethical demands that feel non-negotiable. When external authority conflicts with this inner voice, the conflict can become unbearable. This often leads to a peculiar life path. Such individuals may change careers multiple times, not out of indecision, but because each role eventually reveals its limitations. Once the symbolic meaning of a role is exhausted, it becomes dead weight. They cannot continue merely out of habit. The psyche pushes them onward, even when the next step is unclear. This creates anxiety, especially in cultures that value stability and linear progress. But for this personality, stagnation is far more dangerous than uncertainty. At times, they may envy those who seem content with simple answers, clear identities, and stable beliefs. There is a temptation to surrender to dogma, to dissolve into the collective, to silence the inner questioning. Yet whenever they attempt this, something in them rebels. Symptoms arise, dreams become disturbing, life loses its color. The psyche insists on individuation, that arduous process of becoming who one truly is, rather than who one is supposed to be. Individuation is not a path toward happiness as it is commonly understood. It is a path toward wholeness, and wholeness includes suffering, contradiction, and limitation. The rare personality senses this intuitively, even when they wish it were otherwise. They feel called to live a life that is symbolically true, even if it is outwardly modest or misunderstood. They are often drawn to art, philosophy, psychology, spirituality, or solitary forms of work, not because these fields guarantee success, but because they provide a language for inner experience. You may wonder why I speak of these signs as uncomfortable. It is because each of them places the individual at odds with the collective norm. To be sensitive in a coarse world is painful. To be inwardly oriented in a culture obsessed with externals is isolating. To hear the voice of the unconscious in an age that worships rationality is disorienting. And yet, without such individuals, the psyche of humanity would stagnate. They serve, often unknowingly, as carriers of new symbols, new values, new ways of relating to the inner and outer world. If you recognize yourself in what I am describing, do not rush to label yourself, and certainly do not take pride in it. Pride is a defense, and defenses always exact a price. Instead, observe, notice how your psyche responds to solitude, to falseness, to dreams, to periods of collapse and renewal. Notice the recurring themes in your life, the images that return, the questions that refuse to be answered once and for all. These are not accidents. They are expressions of an inner pattern, seeking consciousness, and as long as you are willing to listen, the dialogue between ego and unconscious will continue to unfold, slowly, insistently, drawing you deeper into the mystery of what it means to become yourself. When this dialogue deepens, when the ego no longer merely overhears the unconscious, but is forced into sustained relationship with it, a peculiar transformation begins to take place. The individual notices that life is no longer experienced as a simple sequence of events, but as a symbolic drama in which inner and outer realities mirror one another with unsettling precision. A chance encounter feels charged. A failure arrives at the exact moment an old attitude has become untenable. An illness coincides with a long-ignored psychological conflict. To the rational mind, these are coincidences. To the psyche of the rare personality, they feel like messages written in the language of fate. Such a person often lives with a sense of being guided and tested at the same time. There is guidance, but it does not come in comforting assurances. It comes in demands. The unconscious does not ask politely. It pressures, provokes, destabilizes. It demands growth, not comfort. This is why many of these individuals experience early burnout, existential crises in youth, or profound disillusionment long before their peers, while others are still consolidating their personas, building identities based on external roles. This person is already experiencing the erosion of those structures. This erosion is terrifying. Imagine standing on ground that slowly dissolves beneath your feet, while everyone around you insists the ground is solid. You question your sanity. You may even envy those who seem so certain, so anchored, so effortlessly aligned with the world's expectations. Yet something in you knows that returning to that certainty would require a sacrifice you cannot make. It would require the sacrifice of the self. The self, as I use the term, is not the ego magnified. It is not the personality inflated to cosmic proportions. It is the totality of the psyche, conscious and unconscious. And it speaks in a language the ego does not fully understand. For the rare personality, this voice is unusually loud. It interrupts plans, undermines ambitions, and refuses to cooperate with goals that are not psychologically authentic. When the ego tries to dominate, to impose a rigid identity, the self responds with symptoms, anxiety, depression, emptiness, or a vague but persistent sense that one is living someone else's life. This is why many of these individuals feel chronically tired in ways that cannot be explained physically. The fatigue is psychic. It comes from the constant effort of mediating between inner demands and outer expectations. To live in society requires compromise. But for this psyche, compromise quickly becomes self-betrayal. The tension accumulates, often unnoticed, until it erupts in a collapse that seems sudden to others, but has been long prepared within. Another subtle sign of this rare configuration is an unusual relationship with time. These individuals often feel out of sync with their age group. In youth, they may feel old, burdened with gravity and introspection. Later in life, they may feel strangely young, open to transformation when others are settling into fixed patterns. This is not immaturity or regression. It reflects a psyche that is oriented toward inner development rather than chronological milestones. Their life unfolds according to psychological seasons, not social calendars. They are also often marked by a deep ambivalence toward intimacy. On one hand, they long for profound connection, for a meeting of souls that transcends roles and defenses. On the other hand, they fear being misunderstood, absorbed, or reduced. Superficial relationships exhaust them. Yet true intimacy exposes their vulnerability, their shadow, their contradictions. As a result, they may oscillate between withdrawal and intense attachment, never quite finding a stable middle ground until much later in life. If at all, in love, this psyche seeks not completion, but recognition. They are not looking for someone to fill a lack, but for someone who can witness their becoming without trying to control it. This is rare, and so love often becomes another arena of suffering and transformation. Relationships may begin with a sense of destiny, of profound familiarity, only to dissolve when projections collapse and each person is confronted with the other's shadow. These endings are devastating, yet they serve an inner purpose. Each loss strips away illusion, forcing the individual to take back projections and assume greater responsibility for their own wholeness. You may notice, too, that such individuals are deeply affected by suffering they did not personally experience. They feel the pain of others, of cultures, even of historical epochs. This is not merely empathy in the ordinary sense. It is a porous boundary between the personal and the collective unconscious. They carry archetypal themes within them: the wounded healer, the outcast, the seeker, the mediator between worlds. These archetypes are not chosen, they are lived, often unconsciously, and they shape the individual's fate. This is why these personalities are often drawn into roles where they serve as mirrors, catalysts, or containers for others. People confide in them without knowing why. Strangers reveal secrets. Conflicts surface in their presence. They become the emotional dumping ground of families, workplaces, and relationships. At first, this feels like a burden, an unfair weight. Only later does the individual begin to understand that this capacity is linked to their own unfinished integration. What they hold for others reflects what they are still learning to hold within themselves. If this capacity remains unconscious, it leads to exhaustion, resentment, and self-erasure. The individual gives without limits, absorbs without discernment, and eventually collapses. The psyche then intervenes, often brutally, forcing the establishment of boundaries that were never consciously learned. Illness, withdrawal, or sudden emotional numbness may appear. This is not a failure of empathy, but its transformation. The soul demands structure. A crucial and often painful realization eventually emerges. Not everyone can be helped, not everyone wants truth, and not every suffering is yours to carry. This realization wounds the idealism of the rare personality. It feels like a betrayal of something sacred, yet it is, in fact, a maturation of the soul. Compassion without limits is destructive. True compassion requires differentiation, and differentiation requires the courage to say no. As this differentiation develops, the individual may appear colder to others. They speak less, explain less, justify themselves less. This is often misunderstood as arrogance or withdrawal. In reality, it reflects a shift of energy inward. The psyche is no longer willing to leak itself into environments that cannot receive it. Silence becomes a form of protection and, paradoxically, a form of power. This silence is not emptiness. It is charged with meaning. When such a person speaks from this silence, their words often carry disproportionate weight. Others may feel confronted, exposed, or deeply seen. This can be unsettling. It is easier to dismiss the person as intense, strange, or difficult than to engage with what they evoke. Thus, misunderstanding follows them like a shadow. Yet, if they endure this isolation without hardening, something remarkable begins to happen. The ego slowly relinquishes its demand for certainty. It learns to live with ambiguity, to trust symbols, to move forward without guarantees. The individual becomes less reactive, less driven by unconscious compulsion, more capable of choosing how and where to invest their energy. This is not enlightenment, but it is a significant step toward psychological maturity. At this stage, the rare personality often discovers a new relationship with creativity. Creativity ceases to be a means of self-expression alone and becomes a dialogue with the unconscious. Writing, painting, teaching, healing, or simply living begins to feel like participation in something larger than personal ambition. The individual no longer asks, "What do I want from life?" but rather, "What is life asking of me now?" This shift is subtle, but it changes everything. Still, the path remains lonely. There is no final arrival, no permanent resolution. The psyche continues to unfold, to challenge, to demand honesty. What changes is the individual's capacity to endure this process without collapsing or fleeing. They begin to recognize that their rarity is not a badge, but a task that cannot be delegated, explained away, or completed once and for all. And so, the dialogue continues, not as a dramatic confrontation, but as a quiet, relentless movement toward greater alignment between conscious life and unconscious truth. A movement that, once begun, reshapes every encounter, every loss, every fleeting moment of meaning, drawing the individual ever deeper into the living mystery of their own becoming. As this movement deepens, the individual begins to realize that what once felt like a curse carries within it a strange intelligence. The psyche, which formerly appeared as an adversary, now reveals itself as a compensatory force, correcting the ego whenever it drifts too far into illusion or rigidity. This does not make the process easier, but it renders it intelligible. Suffering acquires a shape, pain begins to speak, And when pain speaks, it can be listened to rather than merely endured. At this stage, many discover that their greatest wounds are also their most reliable guides. The recurring themes of abandonment, invisibility, betrayal, or overwhelming responsibility are no longer experienced solely as personal misfortunes. They are recognized as archetypal patterns seeking conscious relationship. The psyche is saying, again and again, look here, stay here, do not turn away this time. To do so requires courage of a very specific kind, the courage to remain present with one's own darkness without romanticizing it or fleeing from it. This is where the shadow takes on its most demanding form. Earlier, the shadow may have appeared as isolated traits or impulses that could be named and, to some degree, managed. Now it emerges as a total attitude, a way of being that contradicts the ego's self-image. The individual who believed themselves to be endlessly giving discovers a core of resentment. The one who prided themselves on understanding finds a well of contempt. The one who identified with humility confronts a hidden hunger for recognition and power. These realizations are devastating precisely because they feel true. For the rare personality, such revelations strike at the heart of identity. There is no easy way to integrate them, because they do not fit neatly into the moral categories by which the ego has lived. Attempts to suppress them only intensify their influence. Attempts to act them out lead to destruction. Integration demands something far subtler, the capacity to hold contradiction without resolution, to accept that the psyche is larger and more morally complex than the ego would like to admit. It is here that many falter. The temptation to split becomes overwhelming. One part of the psyche is declared good, spiritual, enlightened. The other is condemned as inferior or pathological. Yet this split reproduces the very conflict the unconscious is trying to heal. Holiness is not achieved by purification, but by inclusion. The task is not to eliminate darkness, but to give it a conscious place within the personality so that it no longer needs to erupt autonomously. As this work progresses, the individual often experiences a profound disidentification from collective ideals. Success, happiness, even virtue begin to look different. They are no longer defined by external standards, but by inner coherence. A life that appears modest or even failed from the outside may feel deeply right from within. Conversely, opportunities that promise recognition or security may be declined because they demand a psychic cost that the individual can no longer afford to pay. This disidentification can feel like a kind of social death. Old friendships fade, professional paths narrow, familiar reference points disappear. There is a period, sometimes long, where the individual exists in a liminal state, no longer belonging to the old world and not yet established in a new one. This is one of the most dangerous phases, because it is here that despair whispers most convincingly. The psyche feels stripped, exposed, without guarantee of renewal, and yet it is precisely in this emptiness that something new begins to constellate. When the ego relinquishes its claims, the unconscious responds with images of wholeness. Dreams may present mandalas, houses, landscapes, or figures that embody guidance and protection. These are not fantasies of escape, they are symbolic representations of an emerging inner order. The self is announcing itself not as a concept, but as a lived reality. With this emergence comes a subtle but decisive shift in how the individual relates to suffering. Suffering is no longer interpreted solely as something to be eliminated. It is recognized as a signal, a messenger indicating misalignment or unfinished work. This does not mean one seeks suffering or glorifies it. Rather, one listens to it. The question changes from "how do I get rid of this?" to "what is being asked of me here?" This question opens a different relationship to life itself. Gradually, a new ethic forms, one not based on rules or ideals, but on responsibility to the inner truth of the moment. This ethic cannot be taught or codified. It emerges through repeated confrontation with choice, loss, and consequence. The individual learns, often through painful trial and error, where they can compromise and where they cannot. They learn the difference between fear and intuition, between sacrifice and self-annihilation. As this discernment grows, others may begin to experience the individual differently. There is a solidity now, a quiet gravity. They are less eager to be understood, less inclined to persuade. They do not rush to fill silence or resolve tension. This can feel unsettling to those who rely on constant affirmation or clarity. The individual has become, in a sense, opaque, but not closed. They reveal themselves selectively, in contexts that can bear their depth. At the same time, their capacity for genuine presence deepens. When they listen fully. When they speak, their words arise from a place that has been tested. This quality cannot be faked. It carries an authority that does not depend on position or charisma. It is the authority of someone who has confronted their own chaos and not turned away. Often, at this stage, the individual becomes less concerned with personal destiny and more attuned to collective currents. They sense that their inner work participates in something larger, that individuation is not a private luxury but a contribution to the psychic health of the whole. This does not lead to grandiosity, but to humility. They know too well the cost of self-deception to claim special status. Yet the loneliness does not disappear. If anything, it becomes more refined. The individual no longer feels alienated in the same raw way, but they remain fundamentally alone in their experience. This aloneness is no longer experienced as abandonment, but as a condition of authenticity. To walk one's own path is to accept that no one can fully accompany you there. In this acceptance, a new kind of freedom arises. Not the freedom to do whatever one wishes, but the freedom to be what one is. This freedom is quiet, almost invisible, but it is deeply stabilizing. It allows the individual to move through life without constantly seeking confirmation or fearing rejection. They have learned, through long and often painful experience, that the most devastating losses occur when one abandons oneself. And so the psyche continues its work, not in dramatic upheavals now, but in subtle adjustments, fine-tuning the relationship between ego and self. The individual remains a student of their own inner life, attentive to dreams, moods, and synchronicities, aware that the dialogue never truly ends. What has changed is not the presence of conflict, but the capacity to remain in relationship with it, to hold the tension without collapse, and to let the slow, patient intelligence of the psyche guide the unfolding of a life that, though rarely comfortable, is increasingly whole. Eventually, there comes a moment, often unnoticed by the outer world, when the individual realizes that the struggle has changed its quality. The inner conflicts have not vanished, but they no longer dominate consciousness with the same ferocity. The psyche no longer needs to shout. What once arrived as crisis now appears as a quiet signal, a subtle tightening or loosening of energy that guides movement and rest. This is not the end of the process, but it marks a decisive maturation of the inner relationship. At this point, the rare personality often experiences a deep reconciliation with limitation. Earlier in life, limitation felt like an injustice, a cruel boundary imposed on one's potential. Now it is understood as form, and form is what allows meaning to incarnate. Without limits, the psyche dissipates. With them, it can shape a life that is both finite and symbolically rich. The individual stops measuring themselves against imagined alternatives and begins to inhabit the life that is actually being lived. This reconciliation extends to the body, which for so long may have been experienced as an obstacle or a source of distress. The body becomes recognized as a vessel of the unconscious, carrying memories, emotions, and symbols that the mind alone cannot process. Sensations are listened to, not dismissed. Fatigue is respected. Illness, when it arises, is approached not only as a biological event but as a message asking for attention and reorientation. The split between psyche and soma begins to heal. With this healing comes a more grounded presence in the world. The individual is no longer suspended between inner and outer realities, but moves between them with greater fluidity. They can engage in practical life without losing themselves, and they can withdraw into inner reflection without disappearing from the world. This balance remains delicate, but it is now conscious, maintained through ongoing dialogue rather than unconscious oscillation. Others may sense this change without being able to name it. The individual feels less urgent, less driven to prove or explain. There is a calm that does not depend on circumstances and a seriousness that is not heavy. This can be disarming. Some are drawn to it, seeking guidance or reassurance. Others feel threatened because such presence exposes the restlessness and avoidance in themselves. The rare personality learns, again, that not every reaction is theirs to manage. At this stage, the individual often becomes a bearer of meaning in subtle ways, not as a teacher in the conventional sense, but as an example of lived integrity. Their life speaks through choices, through what they refuse as much as through what they embrace. They demonstrate that it is possible to live without constant self-betrayal, even in a world that rewards conformity. This is a quiet form of influence, one that does not seek followers and often goes unrecognized. The archetypes that once dominated the psyche now take on a more collaborative role. The wounded healer no longer bleeds unconsciously but knows when and how to offer presence. The seeker no longer wanders endlessly but understands that searching itself is a mode of dwelling. The outcast no longer defines themselves through exclusion but recognizes their position at the margins as a vantage point rather than a punishment. These figures remain active, but they are no longer in conflict. They orbit a common center. Dreams at this stage often become simpler, more grounded. The grandiose or terrifying images give way to scenes of daily life infused with quiet significance. This does not mean the unconscious has been exhausted. It means that a working alliance has been established. The psyche trusts that the ego will listen, and so it no longer needs to overwhelm. When powerful images do appear, they are integrated more quickly, without prolonged disorientation. There is also a noticeable shift in how the individual relates to uncertainty. Earlier, uncertainty was experienced as threat or failure. Now, it is recognized as the natural condition of a life lived in dialogue with the unconscious. The individual becomes less anxious about not knowing, less compelled to resolve every question. They can wait, they can allow meaning to emerge in its own time. This patience is not passive, it is attentive. In this waiting, the individual may feel a growing sense of gratitude, not for ease or success, but for coherence. Even suffering, when it comes, feels woven into a larger pattern. This does not eliminate grief or pain, but it prevents them from becoming meaningless. Meaning is what allows suffering to be borne without bitterness, without the corrosive need to assign blame or demand guarantees. Looking back, the individual may see that what appeared as isolation was in fact preparation. The repeated separations, misunderstandings, and inner crises were shaping a capacity to stand alone without closing off. Aloneness has transformed into solitude, and solitude into a source of strength. From this place, connection becomes possible without dependency, and service without self-erasure. The rare personality does not arrive at a final identity. There is no definitive answer to the question of who one is. Instead, there is an ongoing faithfulness to the process itself. To listen, to respond, to adjust, to remain honest when it would be easier to conform or to withdraw. This faithfulness is not dramatic. It unfolds in small, daily acts of alignment that rarely attract attention. If there is a final truth to be spoken here, it is this: such a life is not meant to be admired, envied, or imitated. It is meant to be lived. Each psyche has its own configuration, its own demands, its own path toward wholeness. The rare personality is not an ideal, but a particular answer to the universal question of how consciousness and the unconscious can coexist without destroying one another. To carry such a configuration is to live close to the edge where meaning is born. It is to accept discomfort as a teacher and ambiguity as a companion. It is to walk without maps, guided by symbols rather than certainties, and to trust that the psyche, when taken seriously, knows more about the direction of one's life than the ego ever could. And in this trust, quiet and hard-won, the individual discovers not peace in the ordinary sense, but a depth of presence that makes even the most fragile moments feel profoundly, unmistakably real.